Okay, the Gilded Age of the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, it has certain characteristics, and then there were certain phenomena that started to address the problems of the Gilded Age. So that's what I want to cover in these few minutes. Politically, in Washington, D.C., the federal government was characterized by what today they call gridlock. That's a contemporary term. Gridlock, the word did not exist then, but the characteristics were there. Gridlock occurs when you have the president from one party and the Congress is dominated by the other party, and they butt heads against each other and nothing gets done. Okay, so it's a bar to the passage of legislation because the president can veto bills from Congress, and they're on opposite sides of the spectrum. They have different agendas. So in the Gilded Age of the late 1800s, we had gridlock. We had Republican presidents, usually, not always, but usually Republican presidents and a Democratic Party dominated Congress, usually. Okay. Corruption. As I indicated earlier, the Gilded Age was characterized by massive corruption, politically and otherwise. Corruption was popularly known as grantism, especially during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant and shortly after that in subsequent years. Ulysses S. Grant, as you know, was the Civil War general of the North. He had won the war for the North, for the Union, right? And since he was a war hero, he was easily elected president. President Grant, like General Grant, the general that he had been, he himself was not corrupt. He was honest, he was ethical, he followed the laws, followed the rules of society. The problem was his cabinet members, because virtually every member of his cabinet in the White House was corrupt. And so it was scandal after scandal after scandal, implicating members of his cabinet. And so that's why corruption was known as grantism. Although the members of his cabinet were Republican, they were crooked Republicans, obviously. There were other Republicans, especially from New England, who were reformist Republicans. They saw the problems, they recognized them, they wanted to address them, they wanted to implement change, give the government back to the people. Those are the reformist Republicans. Okay, so they're going to advocate laws to put capitalism in check, because a lot of the corruption had to do with corporations being out of control. Okay, so although they tried to implement these reforms earlier, they were largely unsuccessful due to the money involved in the corruption. But something happened that gave them more power, more clout. President Garfield was assassinated. President Garfield was elected in 1880, and under the spoils system, the system that existed up to that time, the president was able to appoint thousands and thousands of federal jobs, right, politically. So after an election, it was typical for your postmaster at your local post office to be changed after the election if you have a new president from a different party, that postmaster was liable to lose the postmaster position, and someone new would come in, someone who had supported that election campaign. And it really was that pervasive, the spoils system was that pervasive, where every level of federal jobs was under the spoils system. To the victor belongs the spoils. That's the principle there. Civil service reform. The reformist Republicans wanted for federal jobs to be based on merit. The best person for the job should have the job, not the most political one. And so the civil service reform was able to be passed after President Garfield was shot and killed, because the assassin had worked for President Garfield's campaign to get him elected, and somehow was forgotten about when Garfield handed out jobs. So Garfield had forgotten about one of his supporters, and that person didn't get a job, and so he shot the president. And so for that reason, when they found out why the assassin had killed him, that's when Congress was able to pass the Pendleton Act, which created the Civil Service Commission. So that is why today most federal jobs are based on a test or on some kind of merit system, right? And if there's an election and if there's a change of party in Washington, these people will not lose their jobs. They will stay in those jobs, in those federal jobs. Any questions? Yes?
Why does a gridlock usually happen?
Well, gridlock happens because of the way the Constitution is set up. The U.S. Constitution has separate powers. So Congress, and they have checks and balances against each other. So the Congress has certain powers to create law, through bills. The president has power to veto those bills if the president doesn't agree with them. Just knock them down, veto them, just say no, right? And these laws, even if they are passed, even if the president signs yes, if those laws are challenged by the Supreme Court can knock them down. And meanwhile, the president can appoint justices to the Supreme Court, but with the approval of Congress, right? And so they all have checks against each other, and they all have different powers. This way, power does not reside in only one place, with only one person or one little cabal. Yes?
With gridlock, was it rare for them to pass on?
Gridlock is not that rare. It existed in the 1980s when President Reagan took office. He was a Republican president. He had a Democratic Congress to deal with. So yeah, it happens sometimes, not always. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt was in office, he was a Democrat, but he had a Democratic Congress. So when he first became president, he was just able to give them a grocery list of things to pass, and they would just pass it, and he would sign it. So that was not under gridlock. This was, and the early 1980s were. Yes.
So people like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers were president of this era. Do you know how influential they were to the American government?
Pardon me?
Yeah, do you know how influential people like the Carnegies or the Rockefellers were to the government at this era?
Yes. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller and many other of the robber barons of the most rich people in the United States and in the world, they owned politicians, because they just pay them, and there was no law against it. They'd pay them, they'd give them lavish gifts, and so members of Congress, they would feel like they were indebted to this wealthy donor. So there would be no laws passed to put corporations in check at first and during this period.
So with grantism, did they know that the cabinet was corrupt, or did they only blame Ulysses as corrupt?
A lot of times the president, the president obviously was denigrated because they called corruption grantism, right? But the people knew that it was just the cabinet. And so there would be investigations, there would be sanctions. So there would be consequences. Other questions or comments? Yes?
So would they continue to work under gridlock, or would they try to make an effort to come to an agreement?
During this period of gridlock, this was after the Civil War, and a lot of people still remember the Civil War, and because of that old hatred against each other, not much was able to get done. Because the Democratic Party had been the party of the white racist South at that point, and the Republican Party had been the party of Lincoln. And so there was still that legacy going on. There was not a lot of cooperation, not much. Anything else? Yes?
What was the Civil Service Commission, and how did it work?
The Civil Service Commission was set up by the Congress, and it was run by the president. And recently it's changed its name to the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM. But that was only a couple or 3 decades ago when they changed its name. It still does the same thing. It keeps a list, or a register as they call it, of all the eligible candidates who have applied for a position or for a set of positions, and then they give them a test. So you may have known people that took the post office test, for example. They're going to work for the post office as long as they're in good standing, as long as they follow the rules, until they retire or quit. Right? They won't lose their jobs next election. Anything else? Yes?
So then the Republican presidents didn't work well with the Democratic Congress?
Yes, the Republican presidents would not work well with the Democratic Congress.